Hi, this is Shephard, photo media instructor at Lake Area Technical Institute, Watertown, South Dakota, and this is a quick overview about the use of Nik HDR Efex Pro 2, which is a tool used for processing high dynamic range photos. Those of you that are using Photoshop know that there's a built-in tool there. The virtue of the Nik tool is that it's a lot more complex in terms of what you can do with it. By the way, I use Nik HDR Efex Pro 2 and also something else called Photomatics, which I'm not going to be demonstrating here. And I should tell you that HDR Efex Pro 2 is a standalone application when you install the suite. And this is what it looks like. You load your pictures into the software and it does the processing. But if you have Aperture or Lightroom or Photoshop, it will also install a plugin so that you can do round tripping. And that's actually what we're going to be doing. So let's start with Aperture. Now, this tutorial is based on the assumption that you understand the basics of photographing, of how to photograph HDR sequence and why you would photograph it. I will tell you that it's important that you use aperture priority when you're doing this, because you're putting a series of pictures together into one photo, and you don't want the focal plane to be changing from one picture to the next. So aperture priority. Generally speaking, an aperture in the middle of the camera aperture range is going to give you a better result. The other thing that you need is a tripod, because you don't want the camera moving from one photo to the next. And ideally, you have subjects that aren't moving a lot. I found that when I photograph landscapes on windy days or scenes where there are people moving, that is a bit of a problem. So let's talk about this particular photo. Now, I will tell you there's nothing remarkable about this scene or about the photo. But what struck me when I was looking for an HDR challenge is that there was a huge difference between the really bright and the really dark in this room. And that's what HDR stands for, high dynamic range. So from the very brightest, which is the window and snow that's outside the window, to the very darkest part of the room. And I'm probably doing this opposite. If we were going to try to photograph detail in the shadowy part of the room, we would lose the detail in the brightest part of the room, and vice versa. If we're trying to expose for outside, we lose all of the detail in the shadows. And the human eye can render this scene relatively well, but the camera can't. But the HDR process will let us put all 5 of these pictures together into one that shows good detail both in the bright and in the dark part of the room. Now, traditional teaching has you taking 3 pictures and using something called auto exposure bracketing on your camera. But for the purposes of this picture, I took 5. Now, this one right in the middle is set to aperture priority, and let's see, that's not the photo. There it is right there. This one's set to aperture, well, they're all set to aperture priority F8. And when I just snapped the shutter, this is what the camera saw. In other words, this is as the camera would have exposed it if I weren't applying some kind of bracketing to the exposures. Now, rather than use auto exposure bracketing, what I did was that I just used the exposure compensation wheel on the back of my camera to underexpose and overexpose the photos based on the one photo that the camera said was properly exposed, which is this one. So if you look over here, you're going to see that there's no exposure bias applied to this photo. This is a photo that's 1 stop underexposed, 1 stop overexposed, 2 stops overexposed, and 3 stops overexposed. And the mission here was to try to get something that exposed the outdoors and the shadowy part of the inside. And so having taken these pictures, and I'm not going to do any adjustments prior to importing them. There probably would be a few things I do after I did the HDR processing. I'm going to highlight them all. This is how it works in Aperture. And then what I'm going to do is go Edit with Plugin. And I'll go down to HDR Efex Pro 2. Now, in real time, this is going to take a while because these are 5 raw images, each of which is about 22 megapixels in size. And so this is pretty processor intensive. I would encourage you to consider quitting other applications that you might have open so that all of the memory and RAM can be applied to this process right here. And so we'll sit back and wait for these pictures to be processed and for them to open in the HDR plugin that is part of the way I've got Aperture set up. So there you have it. Now, by the way, I edited some of that out, but in real time it took about 1.5 minutes for this window to open. And I just wanted to show you that it'll show you the 5 pictures up on top. It'll show you the exposure differences from -2 to +2. And it'll show you some other things as well, and it's not so important that we learn about those in this particular screencast. This will show you what the image looks like in the brightest part and what the image looks like in the darkest. And I'm saying that backwards. In the darkest parts of the rooms, you can see that there is detail that's visible, and in the brightest part of the room, the window, there's detail there too. The other thing that I will say is that if you bracket your exposures so that there are 3 stops apiece, you might get a warning in HDR Efex Pro 2. You can ignore that warning, but it will tell you that it may not work properly. Having looked at this and decided that it's going to likely work, we're going to click on Create HDR here. Now this is another thing that's processor intensive, and it's going to take some time, so we'll sit back and wait. And there you have it. And that's pretty amazing, frankly, that it's taken those pictures. You can see that there's good detail in the really darkest part of the picture, at least the darkest part of the room, which is on the non-window side of these pine cones in this display that we have on the table there. But you also see detail out the bright window. Now, part of the challenge in this picture was to also see how well it would how well the light in the lamp would be rendered. And it does do justice to that. Now I'm going to tell you that we're losing some detail in the color here, as well as in other parts over here. In fact, you can see some kind of funky things that are happening, and that's because of lens flare. And there's not really much that this process will do about it. It doesn't accentuate it. Quite honestly, it was just that I was pointing the lens directly into something that was pretty bright. Now, over on the left-hand side, you have a lot of different choices in terms of what you want to do with the picture. And one thing that I see with HDR is that it will do a photorealistic rendering of a scene, and this is really pretty photorealistic. And it starts out with the default here at the top. But as you click through these, you can see what different effects will do to this. Now, I happen to like that one. That's called Balanced. It does a little bit better job of taking care of some of the effects of the lens flare in this scene. There is a black and white tool that will let you show it black and white. Now this looks substantially underexposed. We're going to come back to that in a minute and show you some of the things you can do there. There's black and white artistic. Another interesting detail in this scene is that the light, which is a 60-watt bulb, is putting a pattern on the ceiling just from the structure of the lampshade, which is pretty cool. Dramatic, sinister, pale and structured. There's another one over here where it applies a tint to it. And so some of this has to do with your artistic vision of something. I believe that filters and overdoing HDR will make them look dated a little bit down the road. Let's go back to this black and white image, and I just wanted to show you that over on the left-hand side, you now have a variety of different things here that will affect the way the picture looks. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to crank up the exposure. Now, the problem with doing that, of course, is that we're overexposing the scene outside the window, which is nothing really to look at, except that I'd rather have that better exposed. I do have the possibility, I think, of helping that a bit by adjusting the highlights with the highlight tool over there. So if I slide that down, we start to see some detail in the window, and it does tone it down a little bit without affecting the rest of the image. Okay, so just so you know that there are all of these tools over there. Now, we're going to go back to the balanced one here. I'm going to boost the contrast just a little bit on this one. Try to take care a little bit of the lens flare. And now I just want to show you that under the HDR method here, there are some choices that you have there as well. Some of them more dramatic than others. In this particular picture, notice that it's kind of accentuating some of the grain in the image. This seems to be affecting both contrast and the kind of grain that's showing up. Now, this may be an artificial grain that it's applying. So I'm just telling you that there are lots of choices over here, and it's your call in terms of what you want to do. And you'll get a whole lot of different results based on the kind of image that you're starting with. Now, let's see. We're going to go back to that one. I'm going to change the contrast just a bit on this one. We're going to call it good. Having made the changes, what I'm going to do is click Save. Now what that's going to do is it's going to take this image and the adjustments that I've applied to it, and it's going to put it back into my Aperture library. So anyway, there's the scene. Now, I just wanted to, real quickly, before I finish, show you some things here. There are the pine cones, and we have good detail in the pine cones. We have, it's not a real well-exposed exterior. I could have done better on that, I think, in the original image, probably. But we're seeing shadow detail in a way that the camera couldn't. So we go back to the image that exposes decently for outside. You can see that in terms of shadow detail, well, forget that. But if we go to the image where I'm exposing for some kind of shadow detail here, forget the outside. And the HDR process, though, gives us a chance to see the whole scene. I hope this helps, and I hope you end up doing some good stuff with your HDR processing. Thanks for listening.